Hi folks, and welcome back to Contract Law. This week we are looking at consideration. So this is the last of the Holy Trilogy, what I call the Holy Trilogy, of elements in relation to contract formation, the first two being offer and acceptance. So we're kind of rounding off this little sub-component of contractual requirements this week. And here we are in the Prezi. Quick word to the wise here. Consideration, I don't know if you've had a look at the chapter in the text. If you have, congratulations. If not, buckle up peeps, because you're in for a bit of a ride. I remember when I was going through first year uni myself and I looked at the chapter of the text on consideration, my mind was kind of like, how do I grapple with all of this stuff? It seems like there's a lot of disparate principles and then exceptions to every principle and then exceptions to the exceptions. And I think if we have a look at the way that we looked at theory and we worked out that if there is an organizing principle among many different disparate phenomena, it can make it easier to understand the disparate phenomena. I want to kind of take a thematic approach to our consideration of the topic of consideration because I think it will make much more sense when you are looking at the various different specific principles. Okay, so we can group things together and that will get our brains a little bit of breathing room. The way I want to do it is use these thematic questions, okay? Firstly, we're going to look at the why, because that's where you usually start. Why do we even need to be doing this stuff? And then we can move to a discussion of who, what, and when, okay? And I'll explain that a little bit more in just a tick. So let's have a look at the why. Okay, so why do we have the requirement of consideration in the whole many doctrines we have in contract law? Well, firstly and most sensibly, not every promise that party A makes to party B, regardless of context, is or should be enforceable at law. It shouldn't necessarily be justiciable, except maybe perhaps if you are a proponent of the promise theory. Remember that the promise theorists, they weren't so keen on this whole requirement of consideration, and instead they tended to look to the whole intention to create legal relations requirement to mark off the contracts that should be justiciable from those that should not. So intention plays a fairly important part for those guys. However, for the rest of us, consideration is extremely important because it is a hallmark that attaches to justiciable contracts that show that they are intended to be, and there's that word, intention, interrelationship of the various different requirements, they show that they're intended to be enforceable at law, okay? If we take one step back and we recall that we looked at contract being this notion of reciprocal exchange of one valuable thing for another, you know, you've got all that good reciprocity and mutuality going on. In amongst that, consideration is the price paid by one party for the other party's promise. Mary says, "Do you want to buy my car?" And then Joe says, "Yes, please. I will give you $3,000. Woohoo! There you have the consideration. Okay. Now, you can see consideration really takes a justiciable contract out of those realms of social context, familial context, and all of that kind of thing. And it takes it much more towards the end of the rational maximizer. And here you can hear hallmarks of that economic theory kind of creeping in. You see one rational maximizer, that self-interested rational maximizer, promising one party something and that other party promising something back, something of value. Okay, it has to cost each party something or provide the other party with a benefit over and above things like moral feelings like natural love and affection or friendship or any of that kind of good stuff, which is great and one of life's obvious benefits. But in terms of the law, we need something over and above that. Okay, when you don't have consideration and you have just one party making a promise to another party, really what you have, unless you're a promise theorist, is most likely to be considered a gift. Okay, now there are only very specific times when a gift will be enforceable, and you will look at those principles when you do equity. Okay, but in terms of contract law, you're going to have consideration in the mix somewhere. Okay, the only way around it, and this is our big rider or caveat to all of our discussions that we're going to have today, and that is if you need to get around the requirement of consideration when you are forming an agreement, the only way you can do that is take the whole agreement and lump it into a deed format. Okay, now we did touch on deeds briefly before, but to recap, contracts, justiciable contracts, are simple contracts. Okay, simple contracts will always rely on consideration to support them in order to be justiciable. A deed, on the other hand, the format of a deed has a long and rich history, and because of the solemnity of circumstance surrounding a deed, when you couch it in terms of a deed, one clear way to work out if something has been signed as a deed is the execution panel will say, often signed, sealed, and delivered as a deed. Okay, and often the heading will be deed of forgiveness. All right, that's usually a deed of forgiveness usually applies in relation to debt. So the only way around consideration is to plop the agreement into the form of a deed, and then, as I said, because it's considered to be so solemn, no consideration is required. But, and here is the big but, yes, it will be justiciable, and that's fine if you want common law remedies like damages, okay? No problem there. However, if you want access to that full range, as Graw says, that full range of remedies, including equitable remedies, then you're going to have to actually sweep in some consideration there, because equity and equitable remedies will not be available to assist what we call a volunteer. A volunteer is a person who receives a benefit from another person and has not paid for it. There is no consideration. Okay, so even though you have plopped your promise or your agreement into the format of a deed, the person that is getting something but not really giving something in return, so far as the law would be concerned, they will still be considered to be technically a volunteer. Okay, and because of that, and because of the equitable maxim that equity will not assist a volunteer, you won't be getting equitable remedies on breaches of the deed. Okay, so something just to bear in mind there. Yes, consideration is required for simple contracts. No consideration is not required for deeds, but there are just some pluses and minuses that you need to bear in mind there. So that's the why and wherefore of consideration. The next components of this week's discussion will be, as I said, centered around the who, the what, and the when. The only remaining questions really are how do we give consideration, and where do we give consideration? And if you think about it logically, those kinds of questions will be dealt with by the actual terms and conditions of the agreement between the parties. So it's not something that we can really discuss here in terms of principle, because it will be up to the parties to decide, you know, how and where consideration will be paid. Okay, so that's the whys. Let's end this video here. I think this is probably as good a time as any, and we'll come back for part 2, and we will look at who can give consideration and who can receive consideration. Okay, thanks guys, bye.